What would it take for someone to snap in the face of unimaginable cruelty? What if they were a woman, living in a time where the system was built to oppress and terrorize? This is the untold story of Elizabeth of Virginia, a woman who took matters into her own hands, killing 15 slave owners in an attempt to put an end to the reign of terror. But was she a hero or villain? Stay tuned as we dive deep into her dark and captivating journey. Before we dive into the gory details, let me ask you, how far would you go to protect your family, your people, or your land from systematic abuse? Think about it. Elizabeth's story isn't just a story of revenge. It's a story of survival, fear, and unrelenting will. Let's go back in time. The year is 1850. The American South is a region enslaved by centuries of brutal oppression, racism, and injustice. Virginians lived in fear of rebellion, as slave owners clung to their power. Picture the vast plantation stretching as far as the eye can see, where wealth was built on the backs of those who had no freedom. The grand mansions of the wealthy slave owners stood tall against the horizon, their opulence starkly contrasting the misery of the enslaved people who worked tirelessly in the fields. The air was thick with tension, the slaves, often beaten and broken, bent under the weight of hard labor, while their masters lived lives of luxury and excess. In the sweltering heat, men, women, and children were forced to pick cotton, tobacco, or rice, their hands calloused and bruised from the relentless work. They were herded like cattle, treated as property, and stripped of their humanity. Family bonds were shattered, as parents were sold away from their children, husbands from wives, brothers from sisters. Any attempt to resist was met with swift and brutal punishment, lashes, mutilation, or even death. This was the everyday terror of slavery. The laws were stacked against the enslaved people, making it illegal for them to learn to read or write, to own property, or even to gather in groups. They were forced to accept their fate, the constant fear of punishment looming over their every move. This was a world where injustice was institutionalized, and for many, escape seemed impossible. But amidst this environment, there was one person, Elizabeth, who was ready to defy the centuries of fear. She saw the injustice and knew something had to change. Elizabeth wasn't just another name in the shadows of history. She was a woman who would rise, not just to survive, but to fight back against a system that oppressed her and everyone around her. Born into a time of severe racial and social tension, Elizabeth's early life was steeped in tragedy. A child of enslaved parents, she knew nothing but the harsh realities of slavery. From the moment she was born, her life was marked by the brutality of the system. Separated from her family, stripped of any rights, and forced to live under the constant threat of violence. Her days were spent working in the fields, and her nights were filled with the echoes of whips cracking and the screams of others who, like her, were trapped in a cycle of suffering and fear. Elizabeth grew up in a world where every aspect of her existence was controlled by the whims of slave owners. She saw the violence inflicted upon those around her, men, women, and children beaten, tortured, or killed for the slightest infraction. Yet, despite the cruel system that sought to break her, Elizabeth never lost her sense of self or her desire for freedom. As the years passed, her understanding of the world around her deepened, and with that, her resolve grew stronger. But Elizabeth wasn't content to live and die as another forgotten name in the history of the oppressed. Her determination and fierce sense of justice would propel her into a story that few would dare tell. She wasn't just going to survive, she was going to fight back. Deep inside, a fire was ignited, a fire that would one day push her to take the lives of those who had perpetuated the terror around her. As Elizabeth grew, so did her rage. The world around her was filled with violence, but it wasn't until one event, one brutal, unforgivable act, that her anger would turn into something far more dangerous. She would witness something that would change her forever, something that would push her beyond the limits of patience and tolerance. It was in that moment that Elizabeth's journey of vengeance began, setting her on a path that would forever alter the course of her life and the lives of those around her. It was a brutal beating that made Elizabeth snap. A close family member, someone she loved, was whipped and left to die in the fields. This wasn't the first act of violence she had witnessed, but it was the last straw. The crack of the whip, the screams of pain, the sight of her family member crumpling to the ground. It was all too much. She had lived through years of cruelty, watching others endure the same fate. But this time, it was different. This time, The suffering she witnessed struck too close to her heart. The violence was no longer a distant horror. It was personal. Elizabeth felt the weight of her family members' suffering in her own bones, and in that moment, the silence she had lived with for so long was shattered. She couldn't just stand by and watch any longer. This was no longer just about surviving. This was about vengeance. Elizabeth had seen the true face of the system, and it was a face she could no longer ignore. Her transformation was swift and complete. The victim, the silent observer of brutality, was gone. In her place stood a woman filled with an overwhelming need for justice. Or, perhaps more fittingly, retribution. She wasn't just another oppressed soul anymore. She was a force to be reckoned with. As she stood there in the field, staring at her fallen family member, something inside her snapped. She couldn't go back to her life of quiet submission. She couldn't just be another victim to be broken by the system. Elizabeth had a choice now, to accept the cruelty or to fight back, and she chose to fight. But she didn't just act out of blind rage. Elizabeth had spent too long in the shadows, watching, learning, waiting for the right moment. She knew that if she were going to change anything, she had to be strategic. Anger alone would not bring her the justice she sought. No, Elizabeth understood that in a world where the powerful controlled everything, she had to play their game, and she had to win. So, Elizabeth began to gather knowledge. She listened to conversations of her masters and their associates, learning their routines, understanding their weaknesses, and waiting for the right moment to strike. She kept her anger in check, using it as fuel to prepare her plan. She knew she could not afford to act impulsively. The cost of failure was too high. Her plan was methodical. She selected her targets carefully. The worst of slave owners, the men who had inflicted the most pain on her and others. Each of them was a symbol of the oppression she had suffered. These men had names, faces, and power, but they were not untouchable. Elizabeth's allies were few, but they were loyal. She formed quiet, discreet connections with others who shared her desire for change. These were people who, like her, had seen enough suffering to last a lifetime. They were people who understood the risks but were willing to stand by her, even in the face of death. Together, they planned the execution of each of her targets. Every detail was carefully thought out. The perfect timing, the best way to approach each man, the most effective methods of striking without being caught. But perhaps the most crucial aspect of Elizabeth's strategy was her ability to remain undetected. She moved quietly, blending into the shadows. Her actions were swift and precise, leaving no room for error. She used the very system that oppressed her to her advantage, navigating the world of her masters with the kind of cunning and resourcefulness they never expected. Elizabeth was no longer a helpless victim. She was a shadow, striking when the time was right, and disappearing before anyone could catch her. In this way, Elizabeth began her quiet war, one murder at a time. Each victim was a step closer to the justice she had longed for, a symbol of resistance in a world that had tried to break her. She wasn't just taking lives. She was taking back control, piece by piece. The first was swift, almost clinical. Elizabeth murdered a cruel slave owner in his sleep, taking his life as easily as if she had been trained for it. There was no hesitation, no mercy. He was a man known for his brutality, a man who had made countless lives hell, including her own. Elizabeth had watched him from the shadows for weeks, studying his routine, memorizing his weaknesses. He was the perfect first target, an abuser who never saw it coming. Under the cover of darkness, she slipped into his room, a single knife in hand. He lay unconscious, unaware of the fate that awaited him. The sharp blade cut through the silence of night, and within moments, the deed was done. The cruel master was dead, and Elizabeth had taken back a piece of her humanity. It wasn't just a murder. It was an act of justice. But Elizabeth didn't stop there. After the first death, she compiled a list of the most notorious slave owners, the ones who terrorized the people around her, the ones whose names were whispered in fear. These were the men who reveled in their power, who lived with the belief that they were untouchable. Each of them was a target. Elizabeth knew that to create lasting change, she couldn't just eliminate one or two. She had to take down the very pillars of oppression that held the system together. These men, who thought they were above reproach, needed to be made an example of. The list grew longer with every passing day. Elizabeth carefully selected her targets, making sure that each murder would send a message. She knew her actions would be met with retaliation, but she was ready for that. Every step she took, every life she ended, brought her closer to the freedom she longed for. What followed was a chain of events that stunned the entire South. Elizabeth, with the help of a small, trusted group of allies, systematically executed a ruthless plan. The killings were brutal and swift. Each was carried out with precision, with no room for error. The system of fear that had once held her in its grip was beginning to unravel. In the wake of each death, whispers spread, first in small circles, then in larger ones. People started talking, but they didn't know what to make of it. Some feared the unknown killer, unsure of who could be behind these acts. Others began to see something more. There was a growing sense that the killings were not random, but part of a larger plan, a rebellion. The news of the murders traveled faster than the authorities could react, spreading from town to town like wildfire. Each new killing made the air thicker with tension, and soon everyone began to wonder, who was this mysterious avenger, and when would they strike next? People were both terrified and amazed. Some began to call her a hero, while others saw her as a villainess. There were those who whispered that Elizabeth was not just a murderer, but a symbol of resistance, a woman fighting back against a system that had tried to crush her and everyone like her. To them, she was a liberator, taking the law into her own hands in the name of justice. But to others, Elizabeth was nothing more than a cold-blooded killer. The fear she invoked in the hearts of the slave owners was palpable. They had lived in a world where they controlled everything, from the lives of their workers to the very land they owned. The idea that someone was systematically eliminating them was a nightmare they couldn't comprehend. The backlash was swift. Bounty hunters and local authorities were dispatched to hunt her down, but Elizabeth was always one step ahead. Whispers of her reign of terror spread like wildfire across Virginia, but no one could stop her. Elizabeth moved like a shadow, slipping in and out of towns without leaving a trace. Each time she killed, the world shifted a little more. The powerful began to fear the very people they had once subjugated. They had taken the lives of countless men and women without a second thought. Now, they were being forced to reckon with the consequences. Elizabeth's wrath was their reckoning. In the growing chaos, no one knew who to trust. Was it the woman who had once been a mere shadow in the fields, working under the oppressive hand of her masters? Or was she something else now, a symbol of the resistance, a force of nature in a world built on inequality? What began as a single act of vengeance had now become a movement, a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, there are those who will rise to fight. As the bodies stacked up, the local authorities began to take notice, but they couldn't catch her. No one knew who was behind these killings. At first, it seemed like isolated incidents, a slave owner here, a cruel master there. But as the murders continued, it became clear that something larger was at play. The authorities scrambled to piece together a case, but Elizabeth was always one step ahead. She left no clues, no trace that could lead them to her. The only thing they could confirm was that these killings were precise, calculated, and ruthless, each one carried out with an eerie sense of purpose. Rumors began to spread. Whispers of a mysterious avenger, someone who was targeting only the worst of the slave owners, reached the ears of those in power. But they were helpless. The local law enforcement, composed mostly of men who shared the same interests as the victims, had no desire to investigate thoroughly, let alone track down the person responsible. With each killing, the investigation grew more intense. Yet, the more the authorities dug, the more they realized they were up against a ghost. Elizabeth was a shadow, moving in the dark, slipping between the cracks of society that had no place for people like her. She knew how to blend in, how to disappear. As Southern authorities scrambled to put an end to the killing spree, they only found themselves stumbling in the dark. Elizabeth had grown skilled at evading capture. She knew that every move she made was a risk, but she never let that stop her. She watched, she waited, and she struck when the time was right. For every person who was murdered, the authorities became more desperate, but Elizabeth remained elusive. The hunt for her intensified, but her ability to move undetected only fueled her resolve to continue. She was a woman on a mission, and she wasn't going to let anything or anyone stop her. It was a slip-up that ended her reign of terror. After murdering her 15th victim, Elizabeth was caught. She had been careful for so long, but in the chaos of the 15th killing, she made a critical mistake. The authorities had already narrowed their search, and in the aftermath of the murder, a witness saw a figure moving suspiciously near the scene. It was enough to set off a chain of events that would lead to her capture. The manhunt that had been inching closer finally hit its target. The Southern elite, having lost their grip, finally tracked her down. But Elizabeth didn't go down without a fight. She wasn't some helpless woman waiting to be arrested. She fought back with everything she had, refusing to let her legacy end as a prisoner. She fought fiercely, using the same cunning and will that had allowed her to evade capture for so long. Her resistance was strong, but in the end, the sheer number of authorities that had cornered her proved too much. In the final moments of her capture, Elizabeth stood defiant. She wasn't going to be another nameless victim of history. She had fought, she had killed, and she had survived longer than anyone thought possible. But now, as the soldiers closed in, she faced the inevitable. And yet, she wasn't afraid. Before they took her away, Elizabeth turned to face her captors, her voice steady and filled with defiance. "You may have caught me, but you'll never erase what I've done," she said. "You can lock me up, but the fire I started will never die. It will burn long after I'm gone." Her words echoed in the air as the authorities hauled her away, but Elizabeth knew something they didn't. She had changed everything. Elizabeth's capture marked the end of her terror, but it also marked the beginning of a deeper reflection on the system of slavery in the South. Her actions forced the world to take a long, hard look at the institution of slavery and the people it harmed. For those who had long suffered under the weight of oppression, Elizabeth became a symbol of defiance. To the powerful, she was a reminder of how fragile their dominance truly was. Her story made clear that the system of cruelty they had built was far from unbreakable, and that even the most oppressed could, at some point, find the courage to strike back. Hero or villain, the question remains. Was Elizabeth a hero, or was she simply a woman driven mad by the horrors of the world around her? Was she justified in her actions, or was she just another face of chaos in a world full of violence? In the eyes of some, she was a savior, a person willing to do whatever it took to right the wrongs of a broken society. To others, she was no different from the very people she sought to punish, a killer who sowed destruction in the name of vengeance. Her name is not well known today, but Elizabeth left an undeniable mark on Virginia's history. For some, she's a symbol of resistance, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there are those who rise to challenge the injustices of the world. For others, she's a murderer, no different from the tyrants who terrorize the innocent. But in both cases, her actions left a lasting impact. History remembers the ones who break the mold, for better or worse. And Elizabeth, whether as a hero or a villain, will never be forgotten. The story of Elizabeth of Virginia is a reminder that sometimes, in the face of overwhelming oppression, people are forced to take matters into their own hands. But the cost of such actions is high, and the consequences are long-lasting. Elizabeth's journey shows us the delicate balance between justice and revenge, and how easily the lines between the two can blur when faced with endless suffering. Her transformation from victim to avenger raises important questions about how far we are willing to go for what we believe is right, and whether those actions will be seen as justified by history. Elizabeth of Virginia's story is one that forces us to confront the uncomfortable truths of history. Her actions, born from unimaginable cruelty, challenge our perceptions of justice, morality, and resistance. She wasn't just a woman seeking revenge. She was a symbol of what can happen when oppression goes unchecked for far too long. Her journey from a victim to an avenger sheds light on the darkness of slavery and the lengths one person, driven by the way of injustice, can go to in order to break free. Was she a hero, as some might argue, who fought for freedom at all costs? Or was she simply a product of a broken system, driven to madness by years of abuse? Her actions raise important questions about justice. Is revenge ever justified? How do we hold those in power accountable when the system itself is built to protect them? Elizabeth's legacy, though controversial, forced a reckoning with the institutions that had long held power over the lives of the oppressed. Though her name is not widely known, the impact she left on Virginia's history is undeniable. Her story reminds us that even in the darkest moments, people can rise up and challenge the status quo, and that such actions, while controversial, can sometimes ignite change. As we reflect on her story, we are left to ask ourselves, how far will we go to right the wrongs of the world? And how will history judge the choices we make in the face of injustice?